This is the period in which more normal Americans chose to break a law than at any other period.
Alcohol in our great nation plays a part as far back as the Massachusetts Puritans, who brought with them 42 tons of beer and 10,000 gallons of wine across the ocean. The country was founded with an expectant attitude towards the availability of alcohol. By 1900, the American people were spending $1.5 trillion on intoxicating drinks a year, and 50,000 men were employed in the business. People were drinking 3 times more each year than today's levels. At the turn of the 20th century, a new immigrant influx brought with it an even more alcohol-dependent culture.
In 1920, when Prohibition comes into effect, 2/3 of the population is of foreign birth or foreign parentage. And many of those people had this tradition of not getting drunk, but simply having liquor with a meal, or having liquor as a social occasion.
With their alcoholic tendencies, the immigrants flooded saloons and there engaged in unruly behavior, frightening the already nativist Americans of the time. Soon, people began to see the detestment of alcohol as an American trait to separate themselves from the drink-loving, filthy immigrants. This detestment of alcohol was not a new part of American culture. The temperance movement began early in the 1800s. By the 1830s, as many as 1 million Americans belonged to some sort of anti-alcohol group. In 1851, Maine took these anti-alcohol ideals and outlawed intoxicating drink for the first time in any American state. The previously temperate people of Maine began distilling alcohol in their homes and selling it in kitchen bars. They bought large amounts of medicinal alcohol and smuggled illegal liquor into the state in barrels marked sugar or flour. The Portland rum riots of 1855, killing 1 and injuring 7, were the last straw for the state and caused the repeal of the Maine law. Even after such a disastrous attempt to put morals into law, the temperance movement picked up again after the Civil War with the establishment of the National Prohibition Party in 1869. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in 1874, fought on the grounds of the terrible abuse and neglect suffered by the wives and families of drunkards. They claimed they would restore the founding virtues of the godly republic. The Anti-Saloon League of 1893 claimed, "Liquor is responsible for 19% of the divorces, 45% of the child desertion, and 50% of the crime in this country." The temperance triumphed on January 16, 1919, when the 18th Amendment was passed. This led to the Volstead Act on October 27, 1919, which put into law the illegalization of the trade, sale, and consumption of intoxicating beverages. Just an hour after the enforcement of the Volstead Act began in January of 1920, 6 armed men stole $100,000 worth of medicinal liquor off of a train to Chicago. This was the first of what would become an innumerable tally of crimes committed under the watch of the law of Prohibition. During the period from 1920 to 1933, homicide rates rose 78% and robbery rose 83.3%. The biggest attraction of the illegal trade of liquor was the possible profit. In one day, a bootlegger could make $1,800, more than a prohibition officer would make in a year. Illegal liquor came in primarily from Canada, often across the Great Lakes to Michigan, Ohio, and New York. People would even use private planes to cross the Great Lakes from Canada and pay farmers huge sums, as high as $5 a case, which was often more than they could earn from a year's harvest, to use their farms as landing sites. Criminal gangs, often led by businessmen, started to gain significant power in cities.
One of the effects was to empower organized crime as a business.
Chicago especially was ruled by its thriving gang scene. Most famous of all was Al Capone, leader of the most powerful gang in Chicago during the 1920s. As the mastermind behind his organization, he was able to make profits as high as $60 million off of intoxicating drinks alone. The gangs brought with them to the city not only drinks, but violence. On Valentine's Day of 1929, several members of Capone's gang, disguised as police, entered an enemy headquarters and killed 7 members of the rival gang with machine guns. This occurrence is not unique. As one bootlegger recalls, anyone landing liquor along the Detroit waterfront had to be armed and prepared to fight to the death, as it was common practice for the purples to steal a load of liquor and shoot whoever was with it. Citizens could find pamphlets in libraries and newspapers on how to distill beer, wine, and liquor at home with no trouble. The Volstead Act itself also provided many loopholes in the law to allow them to gain access to alcohol. Families could request medicinal alcohol or join a synagogue or church where they would receive a certain amount of wine each year for religious purposes. The number of rabbis saw a great increase during the Prohibition era for this same reason. Citizens also used the speakeasy as a social setting in which people collectively defied the law. They were slightly exclusive in order to stay hidden from the law enforcement. However, the sheer number of them meant most people would have the equivalent to their pre-Prohibition neighborhood saloon. By 1925, New York City had known 100,000 speakeasies. In fact, the availability of a social drinking setting was increased during Prohibition, even though the measures to do so were made illegal. Within the first year of Prohibition, 32,000 speakeasies replaced the 15,000 legal drinking places of pre-Prohibition New York.
Speakeasies, illegal places, were open all hours of the day. There were no opening or closing hours. They were all over the place.
Speakeasies and bootleggers distributed more potent alcohol than they did light drinks like wine or beer. The price of whiskey and other strong spirits was much lower than that of beer because of the shipping logistics. More Americans who were simply looking for a light drink were forced to use strong and addictive drinks in place of beer. Beer would have altogether disappeared if it hadn't been for near beer, low-alcohol beer that was technically legal and could easily be distilled into beer at home. The biggest danger of bootleg liquor was its deregulation. On average, 1,000 people died each year because of dangerous alcohol, which often contained poisons. One never knew if what they were buying was really scotch or just industrial alcohol with caramel coloring added. During the Prohibition, it took only a tenth as much bootleg liquor as pre-Prohibition liquor to produce a certain degree of drunkenness. Most dangerous of all is that when interacting with the bootleggers, it was easy to gain access to not only alcohol, but hard drugs as well. Intoxicating drink became a gateway drug. Alcohol was so readily available in dry America, it was almost like there was no law against it to begin with.
The majority of American people do not want it enforced and are resisting its enforcement.
The illegalization of alcohol caused the loss of $11 billion of revenue to the government, while increasing government spending by $300 million to enforce. A new drinking style arose, a dedicated drinking, to show clear defiance to the law. The president of Yale told his graduating class in 1922 that they had the option of condoning and joining the masses who supported disobedience to the law or following it based on morals and principles. Corruption's prevalence caused many citizens to see less and less reasons to follow the law.
One quote that I saw from a Cleveland cop during this time period that he said, "How would I enforce this if it's something I enjoy doing myself?"
A Prohibition officer would look the other way for $300,000 a month from bootleggers and gangs. Because of this, citizens didn't see any value in the law. Bootleggers sold drinks to congressmen and even the president, and officials sold pardons to bootleggers to make a little extra cash. It seemed as though the government didn't even want the law enforced, as there was only one Prohibition officer for every 20,700 people. Today, the effects of this criminal and cultural reform during the Prohibition are still evident. First, the helpless drunkards of Prohibition moved on to create Alcoholics Anonymous in 1935 to rehabilitate the new alcoholics. The idea of alcoholism itself was created by AA to distinguish between the people who could drink comfortably and the people who had no control over their drinking and needed rehabilitation assistance. Alcohol companies, careful not to restart the sentiments that created Prohibition, work to associate drinking now with glamour and wealth, instead of the rough saloon culture of before, moving the majority of drinking into homes and private parties by the end of the 20th century. Today, people look at the Prohibition to criticize the effectiveness of drug prohibitions, such as the Prohibition on marijuana, which is viewed today as the gateway drug like alcohol became during its Prohibition. We also see, under the repression of the war on drugs, the re-emergence of powerful gangs, growing off of the profit of the underground drug trafficking business. Using the effective patterns of the Prohibition gangs, drug cartels allowed crack to make a dangerous comeback in the 1980s. Prohibition ended with the 21st Amendment in 1933. But the revolution in criminal methods for felons and citizens alike, along with the cultural upheaval in the views of alcohol and the law, continued to affect American life almost 100 years later.